Hello, I'm Nancy Flinchbaugh, and this is my podcast, Writing for Change. Today, I'm going to talk about vision quests and is God still speaking? Yesterday, I was having a rather quiet day. To be honest, I was a little bored. I'm retired, and in many ways, that's great, but sometimes there are open spanses of time. And while I have 100 projects I could do around the house, nothing really interests me. And I have to also admit, I've been a little depressed recently listening to the news, which has never been a problem for me in my life, but I am a little concerned about what's happening in my country. So it's one of those days when I ask God, speak to me, I need a word. Well, I used to remember one of my friends' churches, they had a sign up, we believe God is still speaking. What about you? Do you think God's still speaking to us? Well, I do. I do think God has spoken to me. And so here I am looking on my laptop, and I see that the senior center has a bike ride that's starting in about an hour, more than a half an hour from my house. I thought I can do that. Maybe I just need to get out of this house for a while and do something strenuous. So I got my bike packed up in the back of the Prius and I was off. Now, I had over a 35-minute ride to where we were starting, and so I looked for something on Spotify. And what I found was an audiobook by Stephen Charleston. And I don't know if you've ever heard of him or not, but he's an Episcopal priest and also a member of the Choctaw Native tribe. And I love his teachings. Anyway, it was an audiobook by him called The Four Vision Quests of Jesus. And I started listening to it on the way to my bike ride. Got to my bike ride, rode, even though I was really slow, I had to ride back with the sweeper who stays back at the back of the lot. And then I rode home, still listening to Steve and his book. And in this book, he's talking about the Native American practice of a vision quest, in which the young person or maybe the old person who wants a vision will fast for 4 days, go into the sweat log, and listen. And for Stephen, he knew about this practice and he wanted to receive a vision for himself. He was just very troubled about trying to bring together his Native American spiritual understanding with his Christian understanding. He was actually in seminary at the time and afraid that maybe he needed to drop out of seminary. So he couldn't do a traditional vision quest, but he went up on the top of a building in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He got some cornmeal. I don't know, I guess maybe that's something related to Native American traditions, and made a circle. And then he stood up there looking to the six directions. I always hear about the four directions, but he included looking up to the heavens and down to the earth, and then north, south, east, west. And while he was up there, a crow visited him and spoke to him and told him there's only one path. And it was a message to him that he should embrace both sides, both his native and Christian traditions. And it was a revelation that really helped him at that time and throughout his life. And now we're all the beneficiaries. I mean, if you should read his books, he's a wonderful writer and he's constantly listening to God and speaking to us. Check out Ladder to the Light. Well, he was describing the Vision Quest. He talked a lot about Black Elk Speaks, who also received a vision, and then he started talking to us, the reader, or in this case, the listener, about when we had heard God. And it's interesting because I was just thinking that day, I need a vision. I need a new vision in my life. But he was talking, asking, have you ever had a vision? And I've never got out fasting in the wilderness for 4 days, but I started thinking about it and I thought, yes, there have been important times in my life when I've asked God for help or guidance, and I felt like God did speak to me. And I started thinking about those times. I thought about when I was in fourth grade, I went to a vacation Bible school and I accepted Jesus as my Savior. And I wrote it down on a piece of paper and I kept that in the bottom of my desk, my little desk, for years. And that was an important signpost to me that I had made a decision to be a Christian. And then a few years later, I was really kind of doubting. And I remember asking, God, are you there? And again, I just felt an overwhelming sense that God's presence was part of my life. And I said, I'm going to serve you. I'm going to serve you. I'm going to serve God and people in my life. And I went on to decide to major in religion and sociology in college because I was so convinced from that vision that I was to serve God and people in my life. I and then when I was in my 20s, I I became a little frustrated with God. Thought God wasn't taking care of the world. I was actually in law school because I went there to take care of the world because I didn't think the church was focused enough on justice, and went through a period of agnosticism where I didn't really know what I believed. And I was in the second semester of law school, which is a very stressful time. And I told God, well, if you're there, I'll listen. And so again, I was seeking a vision. And the following week, after I told God that, there were several things that happened, and two that were significant. One was I was just sitting in a diner having a sandwich, and this man I knew he and his wife, and he came and talked to me, and he was talking about God, and he referred to God as she. Now, that's a little thing, but it was really important to me at that time. But then also at the time, I had a job where I worked at the youth hostel, and I was sitting there in the evening. I could study, and guy came in that I think I'd met before, and we started talking, and somehow he was a good listener, and I just started spilling out my confusion about my spiritual life and my path and my journey. And he didn't try to tell me I was wrong, but he just listened to me, and he made my journey seem very credible. And okay, it was okay to have my thoughts. I majored in religion in college. I had studied feminist theology, process theology, liberation theology. I had been a member of Campus Crusade for Christ. I believed in a personal faith. And then I also had a lot of theological questions. And, he didn't, and I got to the point where I wasn't sure what I believed about anything. He just listened. And somehow that was enough for me to feel God's presence with me, saying, it's okay to be in this journey where I'm at and trying to figure things out, but that didn't mean that God wasn't there with me. And he invited me to his church, which was a Presbyterian church. And at that time, there was a speaker there that I really enjoyed who was reading Henry Nouwen and talking about a deep spiritual life, more of a contemplative approach. And I found a new path where I didn't have to have all the answers, but that I could find God's presence in the silence and in the power of love. So those were a couple times I went through these questions. Later, I was trying to figure out, what am I called to do with my life? Serving God and people is not real specific. I was going to either become a pastor or a social worker. And I didn't really follow either of those paths. And I had also felt a call to work for peace. And so when I decided actually to drop out of law school, God told me it was okay to do whatever I wanted. Didn't try to tell me I had to be an attorney, and I didn't really feel like it was my calling. So I got certified to teach at that juncture, and I thought I can teach peace. And I did do that for a couple of years. And I worked at a food bank and public relations and fundraising. I worked for Christians for Peace in El Salvador. So I had a variety of interesting experiences as a young person. And after I got married, I was staying home actually with my children, my two small children, and I still was trying to find what is mine to do. And because of my call to peacemaking, I became a volunteer mediator. And one of my friends and I planned a small group. We did a lot of small groups at our church, and I was one of the small group leaders, and we were encouraged to be creative. And so my friend Anita and I planned a career discernment small group, and I talked to a career counselor and got a lot of the exercises that she would have her clients go through when they were thinking about what their career would be. And so we put together the small group where each of us in the group would go through these various exercises and then create a packet to share with one another. And then we would pray for each other and ask, what what do you see as my calling? How is God calling me to serve in this world? And when it got to be my turn to share, I remember our pastor was sitting in that night, and I said, I think that my calling is to work for peace and justice, but that's not very practical. How am I going to get a job working for peace and justice? And I just remember him saying, Nancy, if that's how God is calling you, somehow it is a way of working out. And I remember that, Don Reinheimer, our pastor at that time. And lo and behold, a few years later, my husband and I decided to move to Ohio, where I was from, because my dad had a stroke. We started applying for jobs, and I applied for a job at the city of Springfield, Ohio, as a fair housing and mediation coordinator. Anyway, and I ended up working for 26 and a half years doing peace and justice for the city government, as well as intercultural programming. So what a blessing. But that was also, again, one of those times when I sought to listen to God. I heard a message and it changed my life, really, literally. So another time after I got my job, I was also, when I got my master's degree in educational psychology, counseling, and guidance in preparation to become a mediator, I was thinking I might become a career counselor because I just really loved career counseling. And so I arranged a retreat with some of my friends after we moved to Ohio. I came back to Texas, and we were having a vision quest sort of retreat to kind of listen to God. And I thought maybe they were going to tell me to become a career counselor, which, I just gotten my dream job. Why was I thinking I needed to change to career counseling? But anyway, that was my thought. So we had the weekend, and they did not tell me to become a career counselor. Obviously, I stayed in that job for over 20 years. But instead, they said, Nancy, you're a writer. Now, this is not, something that I had ever thought. I mean, I always enjoyed writing. I wrote poems and as a child, and I could write, but it wasn't my calling the way a lot of authors say, oh, this is who I am. I always knew I was a writer, not me. But I said, okay, well, maybe I'll explore this. And there's a book called The Artist's Way. And I said, they recommended that. And so I did that. And it's a daily practice where you do morning pages. You write 3 pages, stream of consciousness in the morning. And then you have a lot of questions to answer and some other exercises to do. And it's 12-week class. And I started doing that, and I started thinking about what I would write about. And I started some small projects, and at church, we started a writing group. And one day I decided I was going to write a novel with God. And that became Revelation in the Cave, my first book. And again, I was just trying to listen to God. I wanted to write about peace. And I thought, and so this book, it was such a journey. It was a vision quest of sorts. I went to Greece and Turkey twice writing this book. It's about a cave, the cave of St. Paul near Ephesus, which was one of the early Christian meetings where Paul lived. And there was a woman named Thecla who's been canonized in the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic Church. It's complicated, but it's about revelations from the book of Revelation. I continued to listen to God, and my husband and I went to a workshop on eco-spirituality. We had been concerned about the earth and what was our role. You start to become aware of climate change, that things are getting pretty serious down here on earth. And in this workshop, we were encouraged to think about what is ours to do. And I thought, well, okay, the environmental problems, climate change, it's too big. What can Nancy do? Nancy can't do anything. But one of the things we did in this workshop was to make a prayer bracelet. And we had different beads, and we were supposed to pray every day for the different parts of the earth, the sky, the water, the animals. And one of the beads was the people bead. We're supposed to pray for the people of the earth, but also pray specifically for ourselves and what is God calling us to do. Now that was a vision quest. I just showed up and I prayed with my prayer bracelet, my earth prayer beads, as they were called. And gradually God told me, I could do things. And, I was a writer. I'd already written a first book. So, okay, the second book is going to be focused on the earth. And that book became Revelation at the Labyrinth. And the Ma'ams, the Magnificent and Marvelous Book Club, who started in my first book, they read about the environment, and then they walked a labyrinth to try to listen to God. And one of them got a message to start a group home for women in recovery. They started an organic farm. And yeah, there are a lot of climate issues in this book with some solutions, as well as just a redemption, because we have such a large number of people who've gotten hooked on drugs and who have gone to prison sometimes because of that. And they need recovery. They need to be able to re-enter society and have a second chance. And so that's what this book was about. And I continued to write. And then I was reading a book called Act of Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy by Joanna Macy and Chris, can't remember his name right now, but anyway, in that book, they recommend writing a letter to yourself from the earth. And we were up in Seattle visiting our son and his friend, and we tried it. We all went away for 15 minutes with a piece of paper and a pen to write a letter to ourselves from the earth. It was kind of a crazy exercise, but I went out and I came back, and as I started to write, I heard these ideas and thoughts that really seemed to be coming from beyond me. When we came back, my son said I couldn't do it. His friend said, well, I could only write a few lines. It was too depressing. My husband wrote kind of a letter from the earth calling us to take care of it. But I got like this wonderful letter. And one of the things she said, I didn't evolve you into existence over 4.7 billion years to have you sit around like a lump on the log. This is a huge experiment and a wonderful dance. Take joy. I want you to start a blog. And there was more to that letter, but it was just delightful. And I didn't quite know what to do with it, but at my 60th birthday party in my backyard, I read the letter and announced I was going to continue to receive letters. And that was back almost 10 years ago now. It became my book, Letters from the Earth, in which over the course of that first year, I received 24 letters from the earth, and I wrote about them. My writing coach encouraged me to write an introduction to each letter and my response, and then at the end, I wrote a letter to the reader about what I've learned, and it's been quite eye-opening. So that was another sort of vision quest, and It's a way that I listen to God when I'm journaling in the morning. Speaking of which, I think all of us need spiritual practices. And yeah, I signed up to take a class on leading contemplative small groups and retreats with the Shalem Institute. And I didn't really know what I was getting into. I love small groups. I love leading retreats and attending retreats. I thought this was right up my alley. Well, I didn't realize what it was really teaching me was to lead people into the silence. When I had been in my 30s, I went to a spiritual director and had two little boys at the time. And she said, Nancy, I think maybe you need meditation or some silence in your life. If you know me, I've been an extrovert. I like to talk. And at the time, my life was not quiet. I had two little boys at home. I could not have fathomed myself becoming silent. But I entered this program and I learned one of the first requirements was that every day I was supposed to meditate for 20 minutes. And I began to meditate, and that became transformative. I think that meditation, in a little way, is like a daily vision quest. You go into the silence, you let go of all your preconceived notions, and you just sit with God. You allow your brain to empty, and that's very powerful. And I ended up writing a book about it called Awakening, a spiritual primer on learning to sit, when I was leading a retreat about it for one of my friends' church. I started this and then I continued, but it's about all the different practices. So I'm kind of laughing at myself today, when I thought, I need a vision quest. I've been on a vision quest most of my life, and especially in the last 14 years since I've been with the Shalem Institute, I have a spiritual practice in which I daily listen to God and I hear God. Yes, I believe God is still speaking. So with my books, the Mams, the Magnificent Marvelous Book Club, after I wrote the book on Revelation at the Labyrinth, I wanted to do something about race because I had worked for over 25 years as a fair housing coordinator, aware of that discrimination is still an issue in our country. And also as a peacemaker, I really want people to come back together. So the MAMs did a series of reading about genealogy, and they had their DNA checked. And they found that both the MAMs, and some of the group home members had, and by this time they had both the farming and restoring with the MAMs, which was a group home for women where they had an organic farm. And they also had a sun power house, a solar business that they did with men, a reentry recovery house. So they had some of their members of these two houses tested for DNA, or offered that DNA testing. And they found that some of them had both Irish and African DNA. So, we sometimes try to separate ourselves from people who are different culturally, ethnically, but I wanted to explore the ways we also are connected. And that became the book Revelation in the Roots, Emerald Isle. And this book was actually the first, I just published the second book in the series, Revelation on the Sea Island. And now I'm writing Revelation in West Africa. But the MAMs are taking their group of members to the lands of their DNA, and also for some of the MAMs. So first they went to Ireland, and Revelation, the Roots, Emerald Isle is a fun tour of Ireland. But it's also a time of listening, because in their group they have both Democrats and Republicans, and they have both African Americans and white Americans, and some people with both African and Irish DNA. And they're trying to understand how they became who they are and how we as a country became divided. and how can we come back together again? So there's my peacemaker coming. I think since I wrote that book, that was published in 2023, we've become even more divided as a country. And then Revelation on the Sea Island is an exploring a visit to the Sea Islands, off the coast of Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and also Black heritage sites in the South. Again, exploring their lands of their DNA and the distinctive culture of the Gullah people, the Africans who were kidnapped to serve as slaves, continue to maintain much of their culture, especially on the Sea Islands where they were isolated. So I continue to listen to God. And then I have I have an environmental novel, Standalone, Mariah the Wind, which is a young woman who falls in love with a wind scientist who's being tracked by a troll from the fossil fuel industry. But in this book, I just wanted to write about the beauty of the earth because as I've opened to God, I just become so aware of how beautiful the creation is and also how important it is for us to care for God's creation. And there are ways to do that. You know, we do not have to destroy our earth in order to have a good economy. And that's what this book is about. So, yes, I've kind of listened to God. I've been aware of God speaking in my life. And I still, at this time, want a vision quest for now. One of my friends is encouraging us to bring Father Greg Boyle to our community because he works in Los Angeles with a lot of the gangs and the drug culture, and he creates a beloved community there with his Homeboy Industries. So anyway, we're exploring that, but I think that's another sort of vision. And I thought maybe that's what we need to have for Springfield, Ohio. You've probably heard of us where they said we were eating cats and dogs, you know, it's complete fabrication. But we have gotten into the national limelight, and because of that, and it's been hard because there's been a lot of hate unleashed on our community. And those of us who believe in beloved community who are trying to follow Jesus want to find a path through this. And so we need a vision quest for that. So anyway, that's a little bit today. Thank you for listening. This is my podcast, Writing for Change, where I talk about my own efforts to write for change and also interview other authors who are writing for change. So check back. I'm on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and I'm keep putting it out there. You can find out more about me on my website at nancyflinchbaugh.com. Thanks for listening. Have a good day and take some time to listen to God yourself.